Good evening. I'm going to call this work session to order. Tonight, Gary Bennett is going to be leading us through a fiscal update, so I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair Hawkins. Good evening, Board of Directors, Budget Committee, people at home. Excited to bring you tonight a Budget Committee fiscal update. Some of our Budget Committee members were able to attend tonight. There's a couple here. There's a couple who could not that are either watching on Zoom or are gonna pick it up at a later time as they had conflicts for tonight. This is actually a new meeting for us. In the past, our Budget Committee started meeting in sort of February or March. And we thought it was important to, as we have fiscal information to share, to bring the Budget Committee up to date, keep them up to speed. I just think it'll make the whole process go better. As we get to some decision points, we'll have more chance to get some input from them and just have a more in-depth process. So that's kind of the point of tonight. We've regularly done a fiscal quarterly update to the board. This one is more in-depth and looks a little bit different than the ones we've had outside of a work session. So that's why we set aside a full hour for it to spend some time and get into some depth, because there are some things to talk about. Okay, it's not wanting to switch slides on me. Why is that the case? Okay, well, it's working now. So the overarching goal is really increased transparency and accountability. We want to really just make sure everybody's aware of what our financial position is over time. You can see the things we'll talk about tonight. All stuff I think you'd expect. What the role of the Budget Committee is, take a good look at our financials, take a look at some enrollment updates. We'll take a look at our levy collection estimations and things like that, and we'll just jump right into it. So those of you who are here tonight, you've seen this slide a couple of times, so I'll go through it fairly quickly. But the role of the Budget Committee, you can see those things are, it's really a way for citizens to be involved in the school district budget process. It's a good opportunity to listen to input from citizens, and ultimately the Budget Committee will take some actions. They'll review the budget at the proposed major fund and function level, make sure that it's in line, we're investing in line with our goals. Really, I know if you want to see somebody's values, look at their calendar and their budget, and that'll tell you what they actually value. And the Budget Committee also sets the tax rate and actually approves the budget before it goes to the adoption hearing of the board. These kind of things are outside the scope of the Budget Committee. Salaries and benefits, contracts with labor unions, approval of contracts over $100,000 in policies. Those are all actions of the board. The rest of those are left for staff in terms of contract terms, staffing levels, and program offerings and things of that nature. Just wanted to make that clear so that folks at home know and folks in the room know what that looks like and are all on the same page about that. So we'll jump into the 22-23 fiscal year. So this is, I think, what's been a missing piece in the past, is taking a look back at the year we just completed and taking a good look at where we ended up. And the good news is we ended up about where we thought we would, and that's always a good thing. The numbers that I'll show you in just a second we're in the process of completing our audit. It's actually in the compliance review process. So these are not officially audited financial statement numbers, but I don't anticipate them changing. I haven't heard anything from the auditor that would lead me to believe they would. But I just wanted to point that out, that these are not finally audited numbers, but I believe this is where we will end. I will circle back with you all if there's any changes at all to these numbers. So this is a sheet you've seen before. It's the sheet we use for our financial forecasts. It's interesting sitting over here and reading a sheet of numbers. It's much different than standing up at the board and reading a sheet of numbers. But we'll go through a couple things, and on all of these sheets where there was things of interest, I tried to highlight the boxes and try to bring some attention to that. So the blue boxes on here, the reason I highlighted those, the blue box on the left shows what our adopted budget was in state school fund formula revenue, and it ended up being pretty darn close to where we projected it, where it was budgeted being. We thought it was going to be low. State school fund budget came in higher than we anticipated. There were higher than anticipated property tax collections at the state. There was lower than anticipated enrollment. And so even though we thought we were going to be considerably lower, that ended up in a pretty good spot. You can see the biggest deficit in our total resources is our beginning fund balance, which started at just over $3 million, which is this number. right here. And our actual beginning fund balance was $900,000. So that was a big chunk of revenue we had down right out of the gate. And you might remember, to get to that $900,000, we had to pull $1.3 million out of a reserve account to get there. So we had some significant problems in 21-22 that led us to our challenges in 22-23. The good news is this bottom line number down here in the corner. We anticipated ending the year with $1 million in the bank. We ended up with $945,000. It was actually a little bit higher than that. There were two budgeted transfers of $50,000 where we'd budgeted money to go from the general fund into the turf field reserve fund and into the curriculum and technology reserve fund, saving money for those two things for the future. We thought we were going to come in at 1.1 million. So we went ahead and decided to make those transfers. Then we had some late expenses come in. So we ended up at 945 and still made some transfers to save money for the future. So all in all, I would say that's a pretty good ending to the year. I think we were all pretty pleased with that. And the other thing, these red boxes, was you can just see the impact of our reductions, where we had $55 million in spending in 21-22, 57 or in 2021, 57 in 21-22. We budgeted 59 something, and we actually spent in the low 58s. And so you can see that change in trajectory, and that was after some pretty substantial cost of living allowances to our employees. So all in all, our general fund ended up in a really good space. Any questions about this?
I got a couple quick questions. I just want to make sure I'm reading it right, Gary. You said that we had to transfer in 1.3. Is that what that contingency line is on the very kind of on the bottom? Versus it has the 1.3 million?
No, that actually doesn't
that?
show in there. It comes it comes in under that all other sources is where that transfer came in.
Okay.
And that transfer was actually made in 2021-22 to close that year. We pulled money out of reserves in that year to close the books in a positive number. Otherwise, we would have had a negative beginning fund balance in our general fund to start last year.
So then what is that line then, since it looks like it's only just for that budget line? What's that?
Which
Well,
line is that? I'm
just-
sorry.
Contingencies is blank on everything except for on our budget line. I'm just curious what that means.
Oh,
Is
that's
that just like a cost overrun? Budget?
yeah, that's because we didn't spend our contingency. So
Okay.
yes.
My only other question is, I noticed purchase services, it looks like between the budget and actual, we're off by, I don't know, $1.1 million or something. What's that? What is that purchase services? What is that?
Purchase services includes everything from electricity, gas, water, landscaping, maintenance services, and we had some significant expenses in irrigation last year. Our energy prices went way up.
Got it.
We actually also had the water. Our water bill was didn't include bringing the high school into service, and so we had been charged by the city too little money for the past couple of years, and so our budget reflected the lower number, and that went up by, I think it was 350,000. 300 was. I don't remember the number. I don't want to quote the number, but it's a substantial increase that hit in there, and so that there's a bunch of things that caused that to go over.
Okay.
Good questions. Any other questions? The thing I forgot to mention out of the gate on this was, this is our general fund budget. This is the budget where our state school fund comes into, our state property taxes come into. This is where the levy will come into. And this is the money we use for general operations. And so this is our unrestricted dollars that we can essentially spend however we see fit as a district to spend. And this is the budget that we I don't know if I want to say manage the most, but this is our biggest source of funding and pays for our general operations. We'll move on and spend a little bit of time. We'll talk about the special revenue fund. This fund is all restricted funds. So this is funds. The biggest chunk of this are grant funds. So our student investment account, sometimes called SIA, is in here. Our high school success funds, sometimes called Major 98, are in here. All of our federal grants are in here. Each have specific reporting and spending requirements. It's actually fairly time consuming to administer. We have to apply for all these grants. I think the student investment account application was over 50 pages this year. That's what it takes to apply for that grant, but it also brings in over $4 million for us. There's also some funds in here like the construction excise tax funds, which is a tax that builders pay when they take out a permit and money goes to the school to sort of offset the costs of new students arriving in our district, and that can only be used for capital issues. There's also things like athletics, transportation, nutrition services all reside in here. So those are the kind of things that are in here. High school student body funds are also in this account. For the most part, it's a pass-through account. Funds come in for specific purposes. We expend those funds and they come into us, they go on out. It's kind of the most difficult to manage and most difficult to track, but it's largely pass-through funds in here, with the exception of some of those things we've talked about, like athletic funds. We'll talk a little more about that later on. Any questions about this one? Okay. So this is our debt service fund. And so when we take out a bond, property taxes come into this account and they pay back this is where we pay our bonds out of this account. There's also a PERS bond we pay out of this account, which is something that we'll need to pay attention to a few years down the road. And the way PERS pension bonds works, I think it's worth explaining this a little bit, is in 2002, the district took out a bond, borrowed money at a fairly low interest rate, gave the money to PERS to invest, with the thought that the PERS investment would pay a higher rate of return than we were paying on the bond, and use that arbitrage or profit to shrink down the district's PERS payment. And it's worked out really well for us. It's been a good thing. That bond will expire in 2027, and there's some things we'll need to talk about that going on, but that also sits in this account. So this is our PERS bond, and this is where we pay our general obligation bonds out of. The good news on this account was, those of you who were on the budget committee and the board last year may recall that we were thinking we were going to have a negative balance in this account because we didn't quite levy enough money. We cut our levy amount too close and our tax collections were lagging. So we expected we would be maybe negative $8,000 or $9,000, and we ended up $46,000 on the positive side. We had some late collections in August, so that's a really good thing on this front. So we levied a little bit more this year to try to build up a little contingency in there to make sure we have the cash on hand to make our payment. But all in all, it worked out really well, and we were pleased to see those late collections come in. Any questions on this? This is a lot more fun when you don't have any bad news to share. I'm just going to put that on the table. So this is our capital projects fund, and these are all restricted funds. These funds can only be spent on capital improvements. This is where we paid for and they're not only just capital improvements, but for the most part, they're capital projects called out specifically by the bond question that was approved by voters. So in this case, the bonds we have remaining in here can be used for construction of the new high school and all the transformation projects, deferred maintenance, and technology and instructional materials, which we set aside a budget for 10 years for those things. Of the bond funds remaining, you'll see a transfer on here that I think will put this into context. Oh, it's on the next, I'm sorry, it's made in this year. We have about $4.5 million for technology, and of those remaining funds, the rest are split relatively equally between technology, or between curriculum and maintenance and deferred maintenance. So we've got a good amount of bond funds left. The good news is we set aside a budget for 10 years for curriculum and technology, and it looks like we're going to be able to make that promise and more for technology, and come in on that promise for curriculum. Adding to our technology funds, just a shout out to our technology director. In the middle of the pandemic, he applied for a couple grants he didn't think we had a chance at getting, and we brought in about $1.7 million that basically gave us a whole nother round of devices for all staff and all students, or at least a good part of those, And so that's really gonna extend those bond funds, because instead of spending those, we spent the grant funds, and so we'll get a whole nother cycle of 4 years plus what we promised the voters, so that's good news on this front. Any questions on this one? So we'll circle back when we have audited financials and make sure that these numbers still hold, but all in all, I would say, considering where we started last year, I think we're in a pretty good financial position heading into this year.
So just my question is, Gary, just really just where I see like where our budget and actuals are really different. And I'm just kind of curious why those things happen. So like supplies and materials, we're looking at 7.6 million, but then our actuals are like 0.7, which changes the operating expenditures quite a bit. I mean, overall, it worked out fine, I guess, like but I'm just curious why the discrepancy between budget and actual there on things like that, items like that.
That's interesting. So the way the budget has been built historically in this fund is a lot of these funds are put on supplies and materials. And so when I didn't build the 2022-23 budget, but I did it a similar way this year, but all of the funds were put in there as funds that were appropriated by the board, rather than setting aside a big chunk of contingency. I'm not answering you. Can you ask your question again? I want to make sure I answer it correctly.
I'm just trying to make sense of a few areas where the adopted budget was way off from the actual. So like the first line item I see on this one is supplies and materials, which is at 7.6 million, right, for budget, but it came in at 0.7 million. So like, I mean, that's a huge difference between budget and actual, and that puts the total operating expenditures at like 8.1 versus 1.2. So am I reading it wrong?
There's that same 7.6.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
So
we're just moving the money around in the place in the budget. That's all that is.
that's correct.
Okay.
What could have happened is there could have been a line of, say, $770,000 for purchase for supplies and materials, and then a contingency of the remaining amount.
Okay.
The way it was set up was just all of the funds were appropriated, and then only a small percentage of them were expended.
So this one isn't as much of a pass through like the debts, the special revenue fund. So that one's like very pass through. Those are all matching. This one is not quite the same way, or it is sort of, but we have a little more flexibility.
These are funds where we don't have the flexibility with these funds. These are focused on capital improvements,
Okay.
and these are dollars raised by the bond,
Got it.
and they can pay for construction of the new buildings, deferred maintenance, and technology and instructional materials. And that's really all they can be expended for. There's also no new revenue coming into this account beyond interest. So we're earning interest on our money, which actually is quite a bit right now, given the state of interest rates. We're earning close to 5% on this money just in a pool account. And so that produces some substantial money when you've got $7 or $8 million sitting in there, but that's the only revenue to this account.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That makes sense. And it may make sense in the future to appropriate less and put a bigger contingency down there. I don't know. That's something we'll need to talk about. There's reasons to do that for sure.
So Gary, just a clarifier for me as well. On your general fund and the special revenue fund. And I'm good. Special revenue fund. Those two are the only funds that have salaries. Okay,
That's correct.
Okay.
At this time, that's correct.
at this time. So, and you mentioned it, but I missed it. The general fund salaries are A, and the special revenue fund salaries are B. Who's who? Who falls in what fund?
So there's a whole variety of things.
Let's this in a simple fashion.
So the simplest fashion is, so I'll give you one example. So we have one of our grants is the High School Success Act, and it has to be focused on some specific things around improving high school graduation. So we've added staff members like credit recovery staff members and mental health folks. We've added, it can also be used for CTE programming. So we've added like an additional shop teacher. And so there are teachers who fit the profile of that grant that are paid for out of that grant. And they're in the special revenue fund. And there are several teachers who are paid for out of grants that specifically have to be used for that purpose. And one thing that's been happening in the state is we have gotten a lot of new money for schools for the state, but all of it has come in the form of grants with restrictions that meet the legislature's priorities. And, you know, for the most part, I've agreed with those priorities. But it restricts the funds and it's a lot of work to manage and report on, and as opposed to the general fund where they just give us the money and we do what we think is best with it. So that's the difference between the two. So most of our teachers are paid, most of our teachers, classified staff, administrators, most of our staff is in the general fund. Those who are specific to grants or other things are paid for out of the special revenue fund. And for a time, we did have salaries in the capital projects fund, but that was when we were actively constructing a new high school and had staff who that was their only job. We could legally pay them out of that. That is not the case anymore. Does that help clarify? Thank you for asking the
Yes.
question. That's great. Okay, so that was one of my goals, is to bring some clarity as to how what these different funds are, so they make some sense, because it's kind of complicated. So that should make moving into so we'll go through them all again here in a minute, because we'll look at where we're looking at for 23-24. So before we jump in here, 23-24 is also looking really good. It's a mixed bag, but when everything comes out in the wash, it looks pretty good. Some of it pretty complex and tedious, and we'll spend some time going through that now. But all in all, we're ahead of forecasts and looking pretty financially strong. I'm pleased with where we are. I do want to start with revenue, and these are just selected revenue sources. This is not all of our revenue. I picked some that were sort of up and down. So our state school fund projection is up by about $400,000. That is because of decreased enrollment at the state over what they originally projected. The pie stays the same size. There's less kids who get a slice of the pie, or every kid gets a bigger slice. I confused myself halfway through the analogy. Yeah, I was like, okay, which way did this go? Never good when the CFO is confused with the pie analogy. So on the other side, and we'll spend some time on the local option levy. Our local option levy collections are looking at about $670,000 less than we anticipated, and I'll spend some time going through why that is, because it does have some implications for us now, obviously, and I think going forward as well. You can also see the student investment account grant. The last estimate we had when we built the budget was from June of 22. And in July or August, they finally gave us our new allocation, and it went up by almost $700,000. So that's really good news for us. Our high school success account grant went down by a little bit. And then the bottom grant is a new literacy grant that the state just approved. And we're just now getting rules on what we can spend that money on and how we can spend it and things like that. But that grant is for this year. And although we can take expenditures back to, I think October 15th is all we can go back to with that. And so it's going to be challenging to administer, but it's a great grant. It will help us out. And it's focused on really K-3 reading primarily, with a little bit of money in 4-5 reading in the first year.
And Gary, quick question, the projection column, is that a full year projection column or is that a year to date?
That's a full year projection column. Yeah, that's what we would project at the end of the year. And that state school fund projection doesn't include the property tax portion of that. That's just the fund we get from ODE. So let's get into the local option levy a little bit, because it's more than a little bit complicated. So this is honestly a full work session in and of itself to really get into this, but I'll try to kind of go through it in one slide to make some sense of it. So, so the short version is this. When Measure 5 passed, the total education taxes cannot be more than $5 per thousand of real market value. So whatever we tax, 5% of real market value. Bonds are not included in that calculation. So it's just what we call the permanent rate, which are the taxes that are allocated to the school districts, plus any local option levy you take out. Those two together can't be more than 5% of real market value. And on this graph, the dotted line is real market value. of all homes in Oregon over time. The blue line is assessed value of homes in Oregon over time, and you can see that the blue line and the dotted line were the same until 1997, when Measure 50 passed, and it froze assessed value of all homes at 90% of what assessed value was at that time, and locked them into a 3% growth per year. So assessed values can't grow by more than 3% this year. So as you know, if you've lived in Portland for a while, the difference in real market value of homes has increased by far more than 3% annually since 1997 in the state of Oregon. And so that's created a gap between assessed value and real market value. So the way this works is local option levies are taxed based on the assessed value. So ours is $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value. What happens is the county assessor levies that money, and if in each individual property has a real market value and an assessed value, and you can look at that on your tax statement. And when they levy the local option levy and the permanent taxes, if it hits 5% of real market value, that's the cap on your taxes. And that's what's called compression. And so there is a limit to how much tax people can pay. And this is the cause of our reduced levy calculation. So I'll look at the chart up here for a second, use the pointer. I'll give you an example of what happened. Tigard Tualatin actually saw pretty robust levy collections. I worked in the district when this was kind of going on. And this is the Great Recession right in here and what happened to the real market value of those homes. When the real market value of those homes dropped, their levy collections dropped in half because those two lines came so close together that more and more of that funding fell to compression and their levy went substantially down. That making basic sense? You have to stay within that 5% of real market value. Makes sense? There's essentially a cap, and if you tax too much, the cap stays in place and the district collects less money. So, question? No, okay. So here's our actual compression when you take a look at it by county. You can see that in Clackamas and Yamhill County, we had very little compression. For some reason, we had 17.65% compression in Washington County. I talked to our financial advisor about this. They were shocked about this. The only way to do this calculation, we talked about doing this calculation in advance to do our levy collections. You have to go property by property and do an analysis, and it was prohibitively expensive. And what's interesting is, so see if you can follow this, but our permanent education taxes, the permanent rate that's included in this was $20.5 million, and those are levied first. And on the first $20.5 million, we had $32,000 in compression. On the next $6.7 million, we had $1.2 million in compression. So an increase percentage-wise of 110-fold or 11,000% increase in the amount of compression on those next dollars. So sort of took us by surprise a little bit. This is what we used 5% as an estimate for compression, which we thought was pretty solid, and it turned out to be more like 16.86%. So I've talked to our financial advisor. We're going to take a look at the data, see what's going on with that. But that's what happened. We had a huge amount of compression in Washington County, and it lowered our levy collections. I thought I had a conservative number in there, and I was going to have to explain why there was more money than I said there was. I honestly did. And it's lower than what we anticipated.
And that this is because, I apologize for you probably already went over this, but this is because the gap between the real market value and the assessed value got larger? Or am I thinking?
Probably got smaller. It would be smaller because there wasn't enough room in that gap to tax. And
Okay,
the other thing that's interesting is, I don't know if people have looked at their property tax statements, but the real market value of my home actually went down
so did mine. That's
This
why
year
I asked the question.
on the
yeah.
property tax statement. And so
Right, okay.
that there may be something, the other thing that I talked to when I talked to our financial advisor about this, she said it may be that there's some adjustment being made because these numbers lag quite a bit. They're in terms of when those estimates are done. And so the assessor might have been trying to make some adjustment for a prior year that was too aggressive or something like that. I don't know what happened, but I know mine went down. And I've talked to other people who did and some people who didn't. It seems to be a mixed bag, but I'm guessing there's something going on there.
I will tell you that we definitely, just from a market standpoint in the real estate industry, the property taxes in Washington County this year left a lot of people going, what is going on here? And comparing your statements from the previous year to this year, because taxes, levy aside, taxes went up substantially,
Mhm.
levy aside. And yet the differences between assessed and real market, the differences there didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so this is something that's up for discussion just in the industry as well.
Interesting.
It's been a bit of a head scratcher, to be quite honest.
Interesting.
So, just
Well, that's interesting to know that it kind of extends beyond us because we were pretty surprised by this. And just so you know how we got to the calculation, our adopted budget was that we would bring in 6,500,000, and that was assuming we'd levy 6.7. Our historical collection rate is about 97.1, so I use 97. That's a pretty solid average for us, and so took the taxes levied, and there's the difference in the $670,000. I do think the one thing we need to watch with this is that given the compression we had this year with, relatively stable actual real market values, I don't know if they're going up or down. You might be able to weigh in on that, Krista, but I think they seem to be relatively stable. If we see a dip in real market value, like an actual dip in the housing market, if interest rates stay high and there's a downturn, we will see more compression in future years if that occurs.
so you won't know that until this time next year. What happens with that, unfortunately.
yeah.
But that is a very real possibility with prices going down, and that's something that everybody should be watching very closely. So
For sure. And so we'll have to be cautious of that in our budget and make a thoughtful estimate of that number based on that time. So the bad news is we had some serious compression. We were sort of fortunate in that our state school fund numbers were up, and so they come out sort of in the wash, and we're in pretty good shape overall. And then we got those other grant funds that were good. So
I'm just curious about does the district have any kind of way of recourse on how these assessed market values are determined? Like, can we go to the county and say, hey, this just looks screwy? Can you, like, I'm just curious. I have no idea how it works here. And this is literally what I do for a living for a software company in Texas, and they've got crazy laws over there. So I don't know how it works here, but like, is there any way, since our revenue is so much tied to the assessed value, do we have recourse as a district of anything to, like, say, hey, county assessor, take a look at this?
as a
Curious.
district, no. Individual homeowners can go to the county and ask for their home to be reevaluated. The time that it takes for that to actually happen won't really make a difference. Especially if they were to get everybody to request that, then you're
Yeah.
looking at a backlog and to be quite honest with you, I don't necessarily know that would work out in anybody's favor. So, yeah, you never really want to ask the assessor to come and evaluate. That's not a conversation you want to initiate ever. So,
and I think what we can do is, our financial advisor, Piper Sandler, who came in and did a presentation to us and works with most districts in the state. She was going to request the data from the county and take a look at it and just see what it looks like. And I'll hopefully get my hands on it too and thumb through it. I don't know that we'll turn over anything too telling, but maybe it's a 1-year problem and those readjust back up. I just don't know. Any questions about the levy collection? I really wanted to make sure people were clear on that because that is a kind of a big one.
So Gary, just a quick question. I know, and maybe it's embedded in some other slides here, but part of that levy collection that you had planned, you'd outlined was also some rainy day coffer dollars, right? To kind of recover our rainy day fund as well. Obviously with a decent kind of shortfall, I'm assuming that that's the piece that's probably not going to accelerate as fast as you had laid out back in May. Or is there going to be shortfalls in other portions of that levy allocation that we should be thinking of?
I think in the bigger picture, we'll be able to build up a rainy day fund that we'll set aside for that levy. I think we'll be okay. I think that comes out in the next couple slides. Because what I want to do is jump into just the forecast for this year and take a look at what this looks like. So I think I can answer some of your questions here on this page. So one thing right out of the gate, there's a new column that I've been really honestly deleting from the prior years. And that's the column on the right, the variance and the favorable, unfavorable. And the reason I did that is our budget really wasn't grounded in what was happening in the district last year, just with the reductions and things. And so that column kind of gave some nonsensical numbers. In a year where we're tracking closer to a budget, I think it's really helpful to look at. So whenever you see a number without parentheses around it, that's in our favor. When you see one with parentheses, that's working against our favor. Not against our favor, but against the budget. This is looking at budget to actuals. So you can see there up there under state school fund and local sources, you can see the state school fund is up by a little bit, over $400,000, and the local sources are down. That's the levy and some other things that kind of mixed in there, a slightly different calculation, but that's what those red boxes are. And you can see on the bottom line there of the total revenue, that our total revenue is off by just over $200,000, down from what we'd budgeted when you net it all together. So that's the bad news, but there's honestly more good news than bad news on here. Those blue boxes that cover the two squares, those represent our payroll numbers. And so our payroll is trending about $1.2 million under budget, and the associated payroll costs going with it are about $600,000 under budget. And that's a really good thing. And so I did some digging once I started to see this trend and really wanted to figure out what was going on with this, because it's a big number. Some of it makes a lot of sense and we expected to have happen. Some of it is moving staff to grants when we get extra grant dollars and we can move staff to them. Let's pay for it out of the restricted dollars and save the unrestricted dollars. Some of it is unhired or unfilled positions, or like a lag. And that happens every year where you have a position that's open for a month or so. That's part of it. We hired a lot of staff this year, slightly less seniority, which plays in a little bit, but that's a really small factor, not a driving factor. Interestingly enough, what is driving a lot of this is a law called Paid Leave Oregon. And so people know what Paid Leave Oregon is. So I'll bring everybody up to speed because folks at home may not know and some people around the table might not know. So Paid Leave Oregon is a way for employees to be able to take some leave for a qualifying event. It's 12 or up to 16 weeks, I believe. I know it's 12 and there's some exceptions where it can be longer. I don't know exactly what the length is. Staff members pay 0.6 of their payroll out of their paycheck into this fund. The district pays 0.4%, so it's a total of 1% contribution to this. And then when staff go on leave, their leave is largely paid for by the state. We actually use a third-party provider to administer it for us, but it's paid out of this 1% payroll tax that gets paid by a combination of the employee and the employer. And for most of our staff, all or nearly all of their leave is paid for out of that fund. In the past, we have sick leave that carries over from year to year. We had staff that were able to take sick leave and pay for those leaves, which means we paid their salary and the sub. Now we pay the sub and the state pays the salary. And so we have 10 certified staff and 3 classified staff members out on Paid Leave Oregon right now. And the cumulative effect of those is a substantial amount of money. That's not driving this whole thing, but it's one of the bigger drivers of this savings. And I was thinking our sub costs might be jumping because of that. Our sub costs are tracking about with budget. I was a little bit more aggressive with budget than we spent last year, but we tend to be about in line. But that's one of the things driving this payroll thing. So one thing that could happen is we have more staff than we have out on leave, and our payroll goes down further. We could also have fewer staff out on leave and our payroll could grow a little bit in terms of the forecast, because the forecast I put together is based not on the budget, but on what we're spending each month. Does that make sense? Clear as mud? Okay, seeing some nods. That's a good thing. So a couple other things on this slide, and then I'll pick up the pace so we can be sure to finish on time. The two black boxes at the bottom down here, our contingency was set at $1.61 million, which is if your budget plays out perfectly, your ending fund balance is your contingency. That never works out that way. We're now projecting $2.3 million for ending fund balance, so substantially better than we were talking about before. The other good news is, so for those of you who may not know this, last year we had several deficit balances in our special revenue funds, and we paid off which one of those we could last year, and we set aside some budgeted transfers to pay off the Medicaid claiming services this year and to pay off half of the athletic fund budget this year. And our anticipation was we were going to have about $550,000 left in the athletic fund to pay off next year. Our savings in payroll and in other areas have been sufficient that this green box is a transfer that will eliminate that athletics fund balance this year, 1 year ahead of schedule. So that's on the consent agenda tonight for board approval. And then once that's approved, we can go ahead and make that transfer. So that's a good thing. So we're not only ahead in our ending fund balance, we are also able to pay that off. So, good news to report on this fund. Yeah, what a difference a levy makes. And thank you again to everybody who worked to pass it and supported it. It's been a game changer for the district. Okay, I'm going to go quickly through the rest of these. There's honestly not a ton to see in the rest of these. With these boxes, you can see those two green boxes. Those are revenue sources. The one on the top is the increase in funds for the student investment account and some other grants that have come in. So that's a substantial raise. The other is the additional transfer for athletics and some other stuff in there too, that $560,000. That's actually revenue. It's an expense going out of the general fund and a revenue coming into the special revenue funds. So that's good news. And the blue box there in the bottom is a transfer out of the special revenue fund to the general fund. You might recall we talked a lot about student body funds and eliminating student body funds at elementary and middle school. That is the transfer of those funds that was in the budget coming into the general fund, where those funds are now in control of the fiscal department instead of at the school level. People at the school won't notice much difference, but it makes a difference having them in the fiscal account. So this is just, again, our debt service fund. This is where funds come in to pay our bond proceeds. The two boxes I highlighted, the adopted budget called for a deficit balance of 8,000 and change, and our actual starting fund balance was $46,000. So we're in the positive on that. That's a good sign. Another side note on this was I looked at what our actual levy rate was, and it was $3.50 per thousand. We promised the voters $4.20 per thousand. And last year it was like $3.45 per thousand. We talked about having to raise it up a little bit because we didn't quite levy enough. So it ended up being about 5 cents per thousand, which was a pretty minimal increase. And it should be able to go back down next year once we build up a little bit of reserve. So I thought that was good news also, I'd share. Our debt service funds, again, set up the same way as Director Thornton mentioned before, with no contingency at the bottom. likely overestimated spending in the forecast. Jim Rose and I are in the process of putting together a long-range capital improvement plan, really a long-range capital maintenance plan. There's no improvements plan. Once we get a more solid look at what a 10-year plan looks like, we'll bring some more information to you in December, where we look at a long-range facilities plan with a project we've just had done by an outside firm. We had a grant from ODE to pay for it, and so that's good. We'll present that in January or December, and sometime next year we'll bring back to you a capital improvement plan just to get you up to speed on what we're thinking on that and get your input on that. We'll be able to be much sharper on this projects page once we get there. Okay, that's the end of the financials. That's probably more numbers than you ever wanted to look at in a night, but that's what you get. But you'll live through it. So I got more numbers for you though. Any questions before I just move quickly through this next part? And I'll be able to wrap it up by 6:30.
I don't have any questions for you,
7:30.
but I do appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know this is boring to a lot of people in this room besides yourself and maybe you. But I do think this is a great way for people to be able to tune in and really understand where our money is going. And I know when there's questions online or I'm in conversation with people, it is nice to be able to direct them back to a meeting and say, hey, if you really want to know all the numbers, you actually can find them all. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this and documenting it so people can look.
Happy to do it. And just so people at home know, and just so all of you know, I thought about building out summary tables of the sort of the highlights. And I decided to just go ahead and put the boxes on the full thing. So somebody who wanted the whole picture could look at the whole picture, and we could focus on some parts that I wanted to bring your attention to.
I think that's better. I think it's better to not leave stuff out.
That's what we decided.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, board members, you've seen these slides before. I took a few select slides out of the previous presentation, and this is more for the budget committee. Just enrollment drives our budget so much, but I'll go through this fairly quickly. And so we'll start by looking at some state trends, and enrollment is down statewide and continuing to decline slowly. And it looks like it's going to decline again this year. That's kind of the early read we're hearing. We don't have any official data yet, but that's what it appears to be the case. This is a trend across the nation. We'll talk a little bit about why that is. It's really birth rates is what's happening. Birth rates are falling. When we look at our local surrounding districts, we looked at a change over 4 years of all of our neighboring districts, and you can see that all of them have been dropping, and some continue to drop, some have stabilized. Sherwood's about in the middle in terms of the percent change in enrollment since 2019-20 through last year. So we're kind of in the middle. Everybody's in the same group. Lake Oswego being the sole outlier at about half the rate of the other districts. This year's enrollments, this is comparing last year's enrollment to this year's enrollment. And so we're 48 students down. The good news is our enrollment continues to climb. As of October 2nd, we were at 4634. As of the 30th, when I put this slide together, we were at 4645. As of Monday morning, we were at 4650. So that's a good trend. We're seeing people moving into our district in the middle of the year, and so that's a good sign. Interesting on that front is that the enrollments that are coming in are largely elementary enrollments, and we're losing some at the high school. So that net of 5 is actually losing a few at the high school and adding some at elementary. That's not atypical to see that kind of growth. It's actually also nice to have them at elementary because it means they're going to stick around with us for a while. So the way the state funds us, I think everybody's seen these before, is our weighted ADM, which takes into account certain things like special education, students, emerging bilingual students, things of that nature. And the state gives us our funds at the larger of 2 numbers, either last year's enrollment or this year's enrollment. So the good news is our state school fund will be based on last year's enrollment, so we won't see a financial impact this year. We will have to watch it next year. if revenue stayed just about flat, we would have a $500,000 decrease or so in our state school fund. So we'll have to watch enrollment carefully next year, and pay attention to that. And if we stay in a declining enrollment state, that's something we'll have to watch. Our demographic forecast suggests otherwise, but we'll need to pay attention to it and see what that shakes out to be. These are just birth rates in Washington County. I think everybody in here has seen this slide before, more than likely, but you can just see the birth rates falling pretty consistently since 2006. And here's a perpetual challenge that the district faces. You can see that our outgoing senior classes relative to our incoming kindergarten classes, there's an implicit loss of over 100 kids on average over the course of the years. And so that's been a case for us for a long time. And we make up for that by, you can look at this chart and see that these classes actually grow over time. So if you look at the kindergartners, they were 332 in 2019, and they dropped all the way down to 298 in fall of 2020. But then they bounce up to 308, 317, and 334, and they grow over time. And this pattern of growth holds. You can go back as many years as we have data for, and you can look, and this trend basically holds that classes grow over time because kids move in second grade and third grade and fifth grade and seventh grade and add to our district, and more move in than move out on average, and that's been a pattern. And I think there are no more numbers left for me to show you, at least today. Any questions, comments, discussion, anything you?
I don't have any questions, but I think this is, you know, a huge reason when we talk about considering supporting Sherwood West development. We know that like we have all the kids that we're going to get in this community at our schools. And so the only way for our school district to grow and continue to be healthy financially is really to have more students move into this community. And obviously I know that we need to do it at a measured pace, but I'm hopeful that bringing on those new neighborhoods will bring some growth to this district over time.
And I just have one comment, shout out to Gary and his team, as well as the budget committee folks. That's a heavy lift and really appreciate it. And this information compared to the last year or two behind us is exemplary. I think that a lot of people will be interested in this. It's understandable, it's available, and that was one of the missions for all of us, and really appreciate the budget committee's work.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you for coming tonight. Derek, we appreciate it. And look forward to the next one.
All right, we'll close this out and we'll be back at 7 for our regular meeting. Thank you.